Hey guys, tonight we're doing something that absolutely no one in Regency England would have approved of, and that's exactly why we're doing it. We're talking about what happened when well-bred, corset-wearing, piano-practicing ladies of the landed gentry developed deeply inconvenient feelings for the men who polished their silver, drove their carriages and trimmed their hedges. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and a very warm thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and you clearly have excellent taste in historical scandal. Your suggestions genuinely shape what this channel becomes, and that means more than you know. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a little surreal to see the spread. The channel is also now on Spotify, so if you prefer your historical chaos in audio form, the link is in the description. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan, pull your blanket up, and get extremely comfortable, because we are about to spend a lot of time in drawing rooms that were significantly more dramatic than they appeared. Let's pause for a moment before we dive in. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to fall in love with someone your entire social class considered furniture? What did a lady do when the man she couldn't stop thinking about was the one who brought in the coal? Was there a moment, some stolen glance across the breakfast table, where everything changed and she just knew she was about to ruin her life? Did servants even know when they were being admired? Or were they just trying to get through the afternoon without dropping the soup tureen? What happened when a lady's family found out? What did ruined actually mean? And was it really as catastrophic as everyone claimed? Could a woman in 1812 genuinely walk away from her inheritance, her name and her social standing for a man who earned £12 a year? And if she did, what happened next? Congratulations. You've just woken up in Regency, England, sometime around 1814. You're a gentlewoman of moderate fortune, excellent posture, and a growing suspicion that the new head gardener is the most interesting person you have encountered in years. Your mother is already planning your engagement to a baronet you find profoundly dull. The baronet has a hunting estate and no observable personality. The gardener has dirt on his hands and apparently knows every Latin name for every flower in the garden. And for reasons you cannot explain to anyone, this is a problem. Good luck. You're going to need it. Before we can understand what it meant to fall for a servant, we need to understand the world that made it catastrophic. Regency England, roughly the years between 1811 and 1820, though the cultural era bleeds several decades in either direction, was a society built on a hierarchy so rigid, so precisely calibrated, that people spent enormous amounts of mental energy simply working out who was slightly above and slightly below them at any given dinner party. At the top, the aristocracy. Dukes, earls, viscounts, men with titles older than most of the furniture in their houses. Below them, the gentry, the squires, the baronets, the families with good names, decent land, and no actual titles but enough social standing to matter. And then, below all of that, separated by a gap that might as well have been the English Channel, everyone else. The servants, the tradespeople, the labourers. Not lesser in any human sense, but categorically, systematically, legally treated as though they existed in a different species of existence altogether. And it is precisely into this airtight world that human feelings, recklessly and without permission, occasionally arrived. Think of it like a corporate org chart, except the org chart determines who you may speak to, sit next to, marry, inherit from, and be buried beside. Your position on the chart was fixed at birth, and the mechanisms for moving upward were vanishingly few and generally humiliating. A man could rise through the church, occasionally through the military, sometimes through successful commerce, though commerce was considered slightly grubby, and even wealthy merchants spent decades trying to wash the smell of trade off their names, before polite society would properly receive them. A woman could rise through one mechanism only: marriage. Marry up, and your position improved. Marry wrong, and you fell, and falling in Regency England was not a metaphor. It was a practical, measurable, daily experience of doors that no longer opened. The gentry specifically occupied a position of particular social anxiety. They were not aristocracy. They did not have titles. Many of them were one bad harvest or one gambling son away from genuine financial difficulty. But they had something perhaps more important than money: respectability. The right family name, the right connections, the right behaviour, and respectability once lost was almost impossible to recover. This is why the gentry was, in many ways, more vigilant about class transgression than the aristocracy above them. An earl who caused a scandal had enough social capital to absorb the damage. A baronet's daughter who made a wrong choice had almost nothing to fall back on. The stakes for the middling to respectable classes were existential, which means that when we talk about a gentlewoman developing feelings for a servant, we are not talking about someone risking embarrassment. We are talking about someone risking everything: her name, her income, her family's reputation, her future, and her sister's futures too. Because in Regency England, one woman's scandal was the whole family's problem. The social rules governing interaction between classes were not written down in any single document. They did not need to be. They were transmitted through upbringing, through the precise observation of how one's mother managed the household, through the accumulated weight of expectations so thoroughly internalized that most gentlewomen enforced them automatically without being asked. You did not need a rule book to know that you did not sit with the servants, didn't use their names familiarly, did not seek their company for its own sake. You simply knew. And when something happened that made you notice you had forgotten, for a moment, to follow the rule, when a conversation went on too long, when a glance held a beat past appropriate, when you found yourself thinking about a specific person in the garden while sitting in the drawing room doing your embroidery, the knowledge that you had crossed something returned with uncomfortable force. That was the world. Clean lines, high stakes, and absolutely no tolerance for feelings that refuse to respect the architecture. And yet, here we are. Here is something Regency novels tend to gloss over. The servant class was not a monolith. There were servants, and then there were servants, and the distinction mattered enormously, both to the servants themselves and, as it turned out, to the ladies who occasionally developed complicated feelings about them. At the very top of the below-stairs world sat the butler, a figure of such gravity and dignity that he was frequently more intimidating than the master of the house. He managed the male staff, controlled the wine cellar, and moved through the house with the specific energy of a man who has never once hurried and never intends to start. Below him, the housekeeper, her female equivalent, equally formidable, equally respected. Then the lady's maid, who occupied a uniquely strange social position. She dressed the mistress, travelled with her, kept her secrets, and spent more time in intimate proximity to a gentlewoman than almost anyone else alive. Then the footman, young, tall, often selected specifically for their appearance, required to wear livery and powder their hair. And then, out of doors, the coachmen, the grooms, the gardeners, each with their own rank, each with their own unspoken rules, and each, theoretically, as invisible as the wallpaper. The below-stairs hierarchy was taken seriously by everyone within it. A butler did not take instruction from the housekeeper. A lady's maid did not eat with the kitchen maids. Seniority was observed. Titles were used. The cook was addressed as Mrs. regardless of whether she had ever been married, because the title denoted professional status, and everyone understood this. If you imagine that the servant class was a uniform mass of people who collectively occupied the bottom of the social ladder and left it at that, you're not imagining Regency England. You're imagining a cartoon of it. The actual thing was a fully articulated social world, running in parallel to the one upstairs, with its own ranks, its own politics, its own marriages, its own gossip, and its own very firm opinions about who was above whom. What this means, in the context of our subject tonight, is that the servant a gentlewoman was most likely to notice was usually not the lowest in the household hierarchy. Kitchen maids and scullery maids were largely invisible to the family, by design and by circumstance. They worked in the parts of the house the family did not enter. The servants most visible to the mistress and her daughters were the upper servants, the lady's maid, the footmen, occasionally the butler, and outdoors, the head groom and the head gardener. These were people of some standing within their own world. The head gardener of a large estate might manage multiple under-gardeners, maintain correspondence with nurseries about plant stock, and possess a working knowledge of botany, soil science and landscape design that many gentlemen could not match. He was not uneducated. He was not uninformed. He simply worked with his hands and did so for wages, and slept in the staff quarters, and that was the thing that mattered. Understanding the servant hierarchy also explained something about the specific texture of the social problem when feelings arrived. If a young lady developed an attachment to the butler, an older, authoritative, socially experienced figure, the family's reaction was one variety of horrified. If she developed feelings for a footman, young, visible, selected for his looks, approximately her own age, the reaction was a different, more urgent variety of horrified. The footman situation implied a certain recklessness of youth. The butler situation implied something the family found harder to classify, and therefore harder to manage. Either way, the response was swift. But the flavour of the family's distress differed considerably, depending on which set of livery was involved. One of the most peculiar social skills required of a Regency gentlewoman was the ability to exist in constant, intimate proximity to other human beings, while behaving as though those human beings were not entirely there. You did not make eye contact with a footman serving at dinner. You did not engage the coachman in conversation beyond the strictly necessary. You did not ask the housemaid how she was feeling, not because you were cruel, but because doing so would violate an unspoken protocol so deeply embedded in the culture that breaking it felt genuinely strange to both parties. Servants were trained reciprocally to be invisible, to enter a room quietly, to complete their work without drawing attention, to look through rather than at their employers. The whole arrangement was a kind of elaborate mutual performance, with both sides pretending that the 12 or 15 people sharing a house were somehow not sharing it at all. It worked remarkably well, until it didn't. This skill was not natural, it was learned, and the learning began early. A girl raised in a genteel household watched her mother, watched her aunts, watched the other women around her, and absorbed through pure observation how to manage the domestic theatre of not seeing. You spoke to servants in the functional mode. This is what I require. This is when I require it. Thank you. That will be all. You did not linger. You did not elaborate. You certainly did not invite reciprocal conversation. When a footman refilled your glass at dinner, the appropriate response was no response at all, a slight unconscious acknowledgement at most, the way you might acknowledge a door opening without looking at the hinge. The person doing it was, socially, the hinge. Think of it as the Regency version of not making eye contact with your barista when you are already late for work and just need the coffee, except permanent, and enforced by the entire structure of your society, your upbringing, and your future financial security. The practical result of this training was that most ladies genuinely did not think very much about their servants as people, most of the time. Not out of malice, out of successful conditioning. The servants were the background. The footman standing by the sideboard during dinner was as much a part of the room's furniture in a well-trained Regency mind as the sideboard itself. This is not a comfortable thing to say, but it is accurate. The social machinery required it. What this means is that the moment the Notzing failed, the moment a specific servant became, in a lady's perception, a specific person, was already a departure from the norm. It was not a small thing to suddenly notice someone you'd been trained not to notice. It had the quality of a light turning on in a room you had assumed was empty. And once it was on, it was very difficult to convince yourself the room was empty again. You could try. Many women did try successfully with great effort and considerable personal cost, but the noticing, once it had happened, was permanent. You could not unnotice a person. You could only manage with more or less success what you did with the noticing afterward. The art of not looking was, in the end, a form of social self-defence, and the ladies who had practised it most rigorously were, in a specific irony, sometimes the ones least prepared for the moment it stopped working. If you wanted to understand the inner life of a Regency gentlewoman, the person to ask was her lady's maid. Not her mother, not her sister, not her closest friend. Her maid. The lady's maid dressed her mistress every morning and undressed her every evening. She arranged her hair, laced her stays, helped her in and out of the elaborate architecture of Regency evening wear. She was present for the quiet moments before bed when a woman's social performance dropped, and she was simply herself. She travelled with her mistress, slept near her on long journeys, and was often the only person in a household who knew the full, unfiltered truth of her employer's emotional state. For many ladies, the maid was the closest thing to a confidant they had, which created a fascinating and sometimes dangerous dynamic. Because a lady's maid was also technically staff, she could be dismissed, she could gossip, she could, under the right circumstances, become something considerably more complicated than an employee. The lady's maid occupied a genuinely peculiar social position. She was not family. She was not an equal. She could not be invited to sit at the dining table or included in the evening's entertainment. And yet she was present for things that family members were not. The private, physical, intimate business of getting dressed and undressed. The quiet conversations before sleep. The small daily collapses that a woman performing the role of gentlewoman could not afford to display in public. A good lady's maid learned to receive these moments without responding to them inappropriately. She learned to listen without visibly reacting, to observe without commenting, to know things without letting anyone know she knew them. It was a demanding emotional skill, and the best ladies' maids practised it with a discipline that would have impressed a diplomat. What this meant in practice was that the lady's maid was almost always the first person in a household to understand that something was happening. Before the family suspected, before the other servants had fully assembled the pieces, before the lady herself had perhaps acknowledged it clearly to herself, the maid knew. She'd seen the slight shift in her mistress's attention. She had noticed which direction her eyes moved when a certain person entered a room. She had registered the change in her mistress's voice when a particular subject came up, or the deliberate flatness with which it did not come up. She had been present perhaps for a moment of private acknowledgement that her mistress thought was unobserved. The maid's response to this knowledge determined a great deal. Some maids said nothing and kept it for years, a piece of private history carried alongside all the other private histories, accumulated in a long career of dressing other women. Some maids, less loyally, mentioned it below stairs, and the kitchen gossip network did the rest. Some maids were actively approached by the family, not directly, never directly, but in ways that made it clear their observations would be received and found themselves in an impossible position that no aspect of their employment had prepared them for. And some, a smaller number, but not a negligible one, became complicit, carried notes, created small, useful gaps in the surveillance, did what they did not out of irresponsibility but out of the specific loyalty that develops between two people who have spent years in daily intimacy, one of whom has the power and the other the knowledge, and both of whom have learned that the arrangement requires a certain mutual trust to function at all. Indoors, the social performance of invisibility could be maintained, with some effort. But outdoors, in the gardens, the stables, the grounds, the architecture of separation became harder to enforce. A lady walking in the grounds of her family's estate was technically in public, or at least in semi-public. She was visible, mobile, and often without the chaperone that would have followed her into a drawing room, and the men working in those gardens, particularly the head gardener, who was frequently a person of considerable skill, education about botanical matters, and practical authority over a significant portion of the estate, were simply there, present, impossible to pretend were wallpaper. There is something about a man who knows things, who works with his hands, who has obvious competence in the physical world, that Regency literature kept circling back to with barely concealed interest. Jane Austen understood this. Her readers understood this. The ladies taking solitary walks past the kitchen gardens definitely understood this. The head gardener of a substantial Regency estate was not a figure to be casually dismissed. He might be responsible for several acres of formal gardens, kitchen gardens, orchards, and hothouses. He managed multiple undergardeners. He maintained correspondence, sometimes extensive correspondence, with nurserymen, botanical societies, and other head gardeners at neighbouring estates. He planned the seasonal planting calendar, sourced exotic specimens, and kept the estate's gardens looking like the sort of thing that got described admiringly in neighbours' letters. A man in this position had authority, expertise, and the particular confidence that comes from being very good at something practical. He was not servile, he was professional, and the difference to a woman trained to expect servility from those below her could be quietly striking. The gardens also had a structural problem from a surveillance perspective. They were large. A formal garden of any pretension extended over considerable acreage, with hedgerows and walled sections and rose walks and kitchen garden enclosures that created pockets of genuine privacy. A lady who had told her maid she was taking a walk could be, within 5 minutes, in a part of the estate where no one could see her without making a specific effort to look. This was not always intentional, but it was not always accidental either. Morning was the particular danger hour. Many ladies of the Regency period walked early. It was considered healthful, the air was fresh, and the household was not yet fully assembled into its social configuration. The gardening staff, by contrast, began work at dawn. A lady walking at 7 in the morning in a large country garden would encounter the gardeners, while the house was still quiet and the social machinery had not yet cranked into operation. There was no one to perform for, no one to observe the correct behaviour of not seeing. Just a woman, a garden, and a man who knew the Latin name for every plant in it, and was apparently quite willing to explain them if asked. This is, if you're keeping track, the precise setup of approximately 40% of all Regency romantic literature. The difference is that in the novels the gardener turns out to be secretly a gentleman in reduced circumstances and everything resolves neatly at the end. In actual Regency England he was just the gardener, and that was the whole problem. Of all the circumstances likely to erode the careful social distance between a gentlewoman and her servants, few were more structurally inconvenient than the carriage. A lady travelling alone, or with only a maid, was essentially enclosed in a small wooden box, moving through the countryside at the mercy of the man holding the reins outside. If the journey was long, if the roads were bad, if the carriage broke down, and carriages broke down with impressive regularity, the social architecture collapsed almost immediately. You had to speak to him. You had to ask questions, receive answers, potentially express gratitude. And a good coachman, experienced, capable, calm in a crisis, had a way of handling those situations with a quiet authority that was, by most accounts, deeply inconvenient for everyone trying to maintain professional distance. Add in the fact that coachmen were often physically impressive, practically competent, and possessed of an easy confidence that came from spending their lives managing large animals and difficult roads, and you have all the ingredients for a very awkward carriage ride back from Bath. Consider the practical geography of the situation. The coachman sat outside, elevated at the front of the carriage. His passenger sat inside, enclosed behind him. This arrangement sounds like it would maintain appropriate separation. And for short journeys on good roads, it did. But for a journey of several hours across the variable terrain of an English county, with roads that had not been meaningfully improved since the Romans last paid attention, the psychological reality was different. You were aware of him. You could hear him managing the horses, the small adjustments of voice and rein that a skilled coachman made continuously. If the road was rough, you felt his competence or lack of it directly, in your spine. If the weather changed, he was the one dealing with it. If something went wrong, a wheel, a horse, a fallen tree across the road, he was the one who got down and fixed it while you sat inside, entirely dependent on his knowledge and capability. Dependency, it turns out, is a very efficient mechanism for eroding social distance. You can maintain the fiction of a person as furniture right up until the moment the furniture is the reason you are not dead in a ditch. At that point, the fiction becomes temporarily unsustainable, and what replaces it, gratitude, recognition, an involuntary acknowledgement of another person's actual existence and competence, had a way of persisting after the immediate crisis was resolved. There are accounts from Regency travel diaries of ladies who describe their coachman with a specificity that reads, in retrospect, as rather pointed. Not improper. Nothing improper is ever explicitly stated in a Regency travel diary, because a Regency travel diary was not private in the way we imagine private documents to be. But the level of detail is notable. The colour of his coat, the way he handled the difficult stretch of road near such and such a village, the fact that he said something in response to some minor emergency that she found. The word that appears, slightly apologetically, is always some version of reassuring. It is the least romantic possible word, and it is doing a very large amount of quiet work in those sentences. The remarkable thing about Regency England is not that cross-class attachments were impossible. It's that they happened anyway, with enough regularity that contemporaries had developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms for discussing them. A lady who had formed an unfortunate attachment, a gentleman who had behaved imprudently, a family who had suffered a disappointment with regard to one of their daughters. These were the polite phrases used in letters and diaries to describe situations that were, when you stripped away the language, simply this. A woman had fallen in love with a man her family found socially unacceptable, and everyone was now performing the collective drama of dealing with it. Diaries from the period, where women wrote with remarkable candour about their inner lives, contain accounts of feelings for family servants that range from brief, mortifying infatuations to sustained, serious attachments that genuinely altered the course of lives. The feelings were not rare. What was rare was acting on them. The euphemisms are instructive. Regency England had a sophisticated vocabulary of social disaster, and the vocabulary was sophisticated because the disasters were not unusual. You do not develop a precise language for something that never happens. An unfortunate attachment was not a new concept to the people using the phrase. It was a known thing, with a known set of responses and a known trajectory. The family understood what it meant. The lady understood what it meant. The servants, who had generally been watching the situation develop from the beginning, definitely understood what it meant. Everyone was using the same set of code words for a situation everyone recognized, and the performance of shock when it came to light was frequently a performance. What the diaries reveal, the private ones, not the ones kept with an eye toward eventual readership, is that the development of these attachments was usually gradual and usually surprised the women themselves. There is rarely an account of a Regency gentlewoman who writes, at the age of 20, that she has decided to pursue feelings for a servant. The accounts are instead of slow accumulations. A person noticed once, then noticed again, then thought about when not present, then actively looked for, then missed when absent. The mechanics of falling for someone who is inconveniently placed were apparently identical in 1814 to how they operate now. The feelings arrived in the same way feelings always arrive, incrementally, persuasively, and without asking permission. What differed was the subsequent experience. The modern person who develops feelings for someone inconveniently placed has options. They can act on it or not act on it, and both choices carry their own complications, but neither is likely to result in complete social annihilation. The Regency gentlewoman who recognized what she was feeling had a much smaller set of options, and the one that didn't end in disaster required suppressing the feeling so completely that it ceased, functionally, to exist. Many women achieved this. The diaries that document the feeling usually also document somewhere further along the effort to extinguish it. Sometimes the effort was documented as successful. Sometimes the silence that follows a series of increasingly agitated entries is its own kind of documentation. Here is a magnificent irony of Regency domestic service. Wealthy families hired footmen in significant part for how they looked. Height was a specific requirement. Tall footmen conveyed status, because keeping tall servants was expensive, and expense was the point. Good looks were valued. Footmen were required to wear livery, those elaborate knee-breeched powdered wig uniforms that cost real money and were designed to make them look impressive at table. They were, in other words, deliberately made attractive, then expected to move through the house as though they were invisible, and then occasionally dismissed when a young lady noticed that they were not, in fact, invisible. The footman who caught attention was the footman whose employment was suddenly precarious, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because the very qualities his employer had selected for had created an inconvenient social problem. It was by any measure an extraordinarily unfair situation, and it was completely standard. The formal hiring criteria for footmen in a respectable Regency household were, by modern standards, startlingly direct. Advertisements and household management guides of the period specify height requirements, with a specificity usually reserved for engineering specifications. 5 feet 10 inches was considered a solid lower boundary for a first footman in a fashionable house. 6 feet was better. The logic was simple. Taller footmen looked more impressive standing behind the dinner chairs or flanking a doorway, and looking impressive was the job. They were also expected to be presentable of face, not a quality that typically appears in job requirements today, because a footman's function was partly decorative. He was, in the most literal sense, part of the household's display. The livery compounded this. A footman in full livery, the powdered hair, the knee breeches, the embroidered coat in the family's colours, the white stockings that required impressive calves to wear convincingly, was a figure that a modern observer would find genuinely striking. Contemporary accounts describe footmen in livery as cutting quite remarkable figures, which was entirely the point, and which created a problem that the people designing the system had apparently not fully thought through. You cannot select a person for their appearance, put them in the most flattering possible outfit, position them in rooms where your daughters spend most of their time, and then be entirely astonished when the daughters occasionally look at them. The footman himself was trapped. He had taken the position because it was well paid by the standards of domestic service, because the livery came with the job, because a footman's position in a good house was a mark of respectability within his own social world. He had not applied to be an attractive problem for someone else's family. He had applied for a job. And when the job became complicated through no fault of his own, when he found himself the subject of attention he had not sought and could not safely acknowledge or deflect, he had no good options. Acknowledge it, dismissed. Appear to encourage it, dismissed, and possibly worse. Attempt to quietly remove himself from situations where the attention was present, also potentially noticed and dismissed. The footman's position in this specific scenario was a masterclass in structural unfairness, and the household management literature of the period, which was extremely opinionated about most things, was conspicuously silent on what he was supposed to do about it. The word ruined gets thrown around Regency social history with great enthusiasm, and it is worth pausing to ask what it actually meant in practice. For a gentlewoman who formed, or was suspected of forming, an attachment to a servant, ruin was not metaphorical. It had specific concrete consequences. First, marriage prospects evaporated. In a society where a woman's primary financial security came from marriage to a man of suitable rank, this was not a trivial matter. Second, social access closed. Families who had previously called, dined, visited, they stopped. Third, the family itself suffered. A scandal attached to a daughter reflected on her parents, her brothers, her sisters still seeking matches. The damage was collective, and fourth, perhaps most insidiously, it was permanent. There was no rehabilitation path, no public apology, no second chance. Once the story was out, it simply was the story. Whether the attachment had been acted upon or merely suspected was in many cases irrelevant. The suspicion alone was frequently enough. Let's make this concrete. A gentlewoman of modest but respectable family, no title, some land, a reasonable fortune by the standards of the time, had a realistic set of marriage prospects that depended almost entirely on her reputation. She was not a duchess with enough social capital to survive a scandal. She was not rich enough for money to compensate for a damaged name. What she had was her family's standing and her own spotless record, and both of these were necessary conditions for the only financially viable future available to her. An advantageous marriage meant security, a house, an income, a social position. A disadvantageous marriage meant reduced circumstances. No marriage at all following a scandal meant dependence on parents, on brothers, on whatever family goodwill survived the damage. This was not abstract. It was a practical arithmetic of survival, and the women living it understood the numbers exactly. The social closure was also not abstract. Invitations stopped arriving. Calls were not returned. The specific performance of Regency social connection, the morning visits, the evening parties, the assemblies, the careful maintenance of the network of relationships that structured daily life, required a reputation that allowed you to enter rooms. A woman with a damaged reputation could not enter the same rooms as before. The rooms, quite literally, became unavailable. This was not dramatic exile or formal banishment. It was quieter and in some ways worse, a gradual polite withdrawal by people who had previously been warm, a series of small refusals and non-appearances that added up over weeks and months to a complete restructuring of daily existence. What is perhaps most striking looking back is how little agency a woman had over her own ruin. Suspicion was enough. A rumour was enough. A footman who was dismissed and mentioned, to someone who mentioned it to someone else, what had occasioned his dismissal, that was enough. The woman had not necessarily done anything. She had felt something, perhaps acted on nothing, and the social machinery had nonetheless registered the feeling and responded to it with the full apparatus of consequence. Intention was not the relevant category. Perception was. And once perception had formed, the practical reality followed, reliably and without appeal. One of the primary mechanisms by which Regency society attempted to prevent exactly the kinds of situations we're discussing tonight was the institution of the chaperone. A young gentlewoman was not supposed to be alone with any man who was not a close family member, not a suitor, not a neighbour's son, and certainly not a member of staff. The chaperone was the physical embodiment of social control. An older woman, usually a relation, whose job was to be present at all times, and whose presence was understood by everyone to mean that nothing was happening and nothing could happen. The problem, the structurally inevitable, completely predictable problem, was that chaperones could not be everywhere. Gardens were large, houses had multiple wings, ladies woke early and walked before the household was fully assembled, and a chaperone who was elderly or slightly deaf or mildly occupied with her embroidery was a chaperone who had, practically speaking, ceased to function as a chaperone. The chaperone system was, in theory, airtight. A young gentlewoman was accompanied. She was visible. She was never alone with a man in circumstances that could give rise to gossip because she was never, technically, alone with a man at all. Her chaperone was always there, except that the chaperone was a human being, and human beings get tired and sleepy and absorbed in their own correspondence, and occasionally persuaded that a brief absence of 15 minutes would surely be fine, and this was the structural flaw at the heart of an otherwise impressively designed surveillance apparatus. The chaperone's role was also not applied to servants, because servants were not men in the relevant social sense. The social rules around chaperoning were designed to prevent a gentlewoman from being alone with a social equal or superior whose intentions toward her were romantic. The footman did not fall into this category in the framework's imagination. He was staff, furniture, a member of the household inventory. The chaperone system had not been designed for him because the people designing the chaperone system had assumed that the relevant threat came from within the social class, not from below it. This was one of the system's more consequential oversights, which meant that a gentlewoman who was impeccably chaperoned in every drawing room, at every assembly, during every drive in a carriage with a suitable young man of appropriate family, was simultaneously completely unmonitored in the kitchen garden at 7 a.m, or on the back staircase in the middle of the afternoon, or in the stables when she'd come to inquire about her horse, and the groom was the only person present. The chaperone, sitting comfortably with her embroidery in the morning room, was chaperoning a performance that was happening in a different part of the building. The actual situation was somewhere else entirely, and nobody had thought to post anyone there because, officially, there was nothing to watch for. The irony is almost architectural. The entire structure of a Regency social surveillance, the chaperones, the rules about mixed company, the careful management of who could be alone with whom and for how long, was built facing one direction. And the danger, when it arrived, came from exactly the direction nobody was watching. In the Regency period, letters were the primary technology of emotional communication. People wrote constantly, at length, with considerable feeling, and the letter, sealed, delivered by hand within a household, kept in boxes and drawers, was also the primary way that attachments, appropriate and otherwise, were documented and sometimes discovered. A lady who wrote to a servant or received a note from one was engaged in something that, if found, could destroy her entirely. The letter was both the expression of the attachment and the evidence against her. Household diaries occasionally record the discovery of such correspondence. A mother finding letters in her daughter's writing desk, a housekeeper reporting a note passed in the corridor, a dismissed servant who had, for various reasons, kept what he was given. The letter that should have been burned had a way of surviving, and the letter that survived had a way of ending things. To understand why written communication was so particularly dangerous, you need to understand what letters meant in Regency England. They were not casual. A letter was a composed, deliberate act. You sat down, you chose your words, you sealed the result and sent it forward into the world with your name on it. The physical letter was evidence in a way that a conversation was not. A conversation could be denied, misremembered, attributed to misunderstanding. A letter in your own handwriting addressed to a footman and found in his coat pocket was not available for reinterpretation. It was, in the most literal sense, proof. And proof, in a world where the social consequences of an attachment were already severe based on suspicion alone, was catastrophic. Women in the Regency period generally understood this. They were taught from an early age that letters were permanent, that what you wrote could be kept, copied, shared, read aloud in drawing rooms, produced in legal proceedings. The epistolary novel, which was an enormously popular genre precisely because everyone understood how letters worked, had spent decades dramatizing the dangers of written communication. Every Regency gentlewoman who had read her novels, and most of them had, knew in theory that letters were dangerous. Theory and feeling, however, operate on different timescales, and when feeling was present and strong, the theoretical danger of the letter had a tendency to feel less urgent than the practical need to communicate. The notes that circulated within a household were a slightly different matter from formal letters. A folded piece of paper passed in a corridor, left on a windowsill, tucked into a specific book in the library. These were smaller, more deniable, often unsigned. But they were also easier to intercept, easier to misplace, easier to find when a servant's room was searched, as it sometimes was when a family became suspicious. The household itself was the delivery system, and the household had multiple eyes. A note passed from a lady to a footman through a third party, a maid, a younger servant who had been persuaded to carry it, created a chain of knowledge that was longer and less controllable than the lady writing it had generally accounted for. There is something particular about the position of the servant who received written communication from his employer's daughter. He could not safely keep it. If found, it destroyed him. He could not safely destroy it in the house. Paper burned in a fireplace was sometimes noticed. He could not safely return it. That conversation did not bear thinking about. He was in possession of an object that was simultaneously precious, dangerous, and completely unmanageable. The letter that had felt when written like connection, like the bridge across an uncrossable gap, arrived in his hands as a problem with no clean solution. And yet many of them were kept, found years later in coat pockets, tucked inside the pages of a Bible, folded small and pressed into the lining of a box. The letter that should have been burned, and wasn't, because burning it meant that it was truly gone, and that specific form of finality was apparently harder than the risk. Before we spend too much time romanticizing any of this, it is worth sitting with something uncomfortable. The power differential between a gentlewoman and her servants ran in one direction socially. She had status, he had none, but the practical power in any specific interaction was considerably more complicated. A servant who attracted the attention of his employer's daughter was in a profoundly precarious position. He could not refuse without risking his position. He could not encourage without risking his life, or at minimum, his livelihood. If the attachment became known, he would almost certainly be dismissed. possibly prosecuted and unable to find employment in any respectable household again. The same scandal that ruined a lady left a male servant considerably worse off in material terms. He had no inheritance to lose because he had none. What he had was a job, a reference, and a reputation, all of which could vanish overnight. The romance, when examined from his position rather than hers, looked quite different. The power dynamics at play in these situations were genuinely layered in ways that the romantic narrative tends to flatten. From a social perspective, the hierarchy was absolute. She was the daughter of the house, he was the employee. Her family controlled his employment, his reference, his future prospects in domestic service. One word from her father, or her mother, or even a disapproving older sibling, and he was gone. That is a very large amount of power located in one direction. But within any specific interaction, the social calculus inverted in complicated ways. She was the one who was behaving outside the social rules. She was the one who had more to lose from exposure, because the consequences for her were public and permanent in ways that the servant's consequences, while materially severe, were not. He could move to a different county. He could change his name, find work in a different sector, rebuild quietly in anonymity. She could not. Her ruin was social and permanent and everywhere she went in her original world. This created an interaction in which both parties were genuinely vulnerable, but in completely different directions, and in which neither vulnerability was visible to the other. She saw someone with no social power. He saw someone with total institutional power over his life. Both of them were right, and neither of them had the full picture, and this particular combination of mutual partial knowledge was a reliable engine of misunderstanding and misery. The question of what a male servant was supposed to do when he found himself the object of a lady's attention was one that the household management literature of the period did not address, because it preferred not to acknowledge the situation existed. The conduct literature aimed at servants, and there was a significant body of it, focused on diligence, discretion, honesty, and the avoidance of situations that could bring the household into disrepute. What it did not provide was practical guidance for the footman who had done nothing wrong and found himself in a situation that could end his career regardless of what he did next. The advice, insofar as it existed, was essentially disappear. Become more invisible than you already were. Hope that it passed, and if it did not pass, accept that you were probably going to lose your position through no fault of your own, because that was how the system worked, and the system was not designed with your interest in mind. The honest accounting of these situations requires acknowledging that the romance, the story of forbidden feeling and impossible love, was experienced very differently depending on which side of the divide you were standing on. For the lady, it was a story about feeling. For the servant, it was a story about employment, survival, and the specific precariousness of a life lived entirely at the discretion of people who held all the institutional cards. Both stories were real. They were happening simultaneously to two people in the same house, and they were not the same story. Women in the Regency period kept diaries, sometimes extensively, and these diaries are among the most useful historical documents we have for understanding what they actually thought, as opposed to what they were supposed to think. The public performance of Regency womanhood was one thing. Composed, obedient, appropriately modest. The private written record is considerably more interesting. Diaries from the period contain passages of striking emotional directness, observations about servants that begin professionally and gradually become something else, records of conversations that went on longer than necessary, descriptions of men that focus on qualities nobody was supposed to notice. There is an account from a gentlewoman in 1817 who wrote about her family's head groom with an accumulating specificity. The colour of his coat, the way he spoke to the horses, The fact that he had once caught her when she stumbled on the stable-yard steps, that a diary editor a century later clearly found awkward enough to partially transcribe in Latin. The feelings were there. They were recorded. They were mostly never acted upon. The Regency diary was a complicated document. It was private in the sense that it was not intended for general circulation. But it was not private in the modern sense, the sense of a document created with the absolute expectation of permanent confidentiality. Diaries were sometimes read by family members. They were sometimes found. They were sometimes, after a woman's death, edited and published by well-meaning descendants who occasionally encountered passages they wished weren't there. The woman keeping a Regency diary was writing in an ambiguous space. Private enough to be honest, but not so private that she could afford to be entirely unguarded. This means that what appears in the diaries represents the feelings that were strong enough to be recorded despite the risk of the diary being read. Anything that made it onto the page had cleared a fairly high bar of emotional significance. What the diaries show is a consistent pattern in the way these attachments developed and were processed. The first mention of a particular servant is usually functional, a note about some task performed, some aspect of household management. The second mention is slightly more specific, a detail included that was not strictly necessary to the record. By the third or fourth mention, the specificity has accumulated to a point where it is clearly no longer about household management. The woman is writing about a person. She is noticing things, the way he does a particular thing, a remark he made, something that struck her as unexpectedly intelligent or unexpectedly kind. And then, in many diaries, there is a gap, or a sudden shift to elaborate blandness, or occasionally a direct acknowledgement, written in a smaller hand as though the writer were trying to take up less space on the page, something that translates across 2 centuries as I am aware that this is a problem and I am working on it. The diary as a historical document also reveals how much time women spent on this particular form of working on it. Pages and pages, in some cases, of the internal argument between feeling and sense, between what was wanted and what was permitted, between the part of a woman that was fully human and the part that had been so thoroughly trained in Regency womanhood that it could mount a fairly convincing case for the other side. The internal argument was real and sustained, and in most cases eventually resolved in the direction of social convention. But the length of it, the detail and energy expended on it, tells you something important. It was not easy. It was not a small thing to suppress. And the women who managed it successfully were not doing so because they didn't feel much. They were doing it because they felt a great deal and chose at considerable personal cost to feel it in silence. When a family discovered that a daughter had formed an attachment to a servant, or when they suspected it strongly enough to act, the response was swift and followed a fairly consistent pattern. First, the servant was dismissed, immediately, usually without a reference, which in practical terms meant he was cut off from future employment in any comparable household. Second, the daughter was removed, sent to stay with relatives, ideally at some distance, a grandmother in another county, an aunt in Scotland, someone willing to receive her and say nothing. Third, the situation was managed socially. Carefully worded letters were written. Visits were declined. The story was controlled as far as possible before it could spread. The family's goal was not justice, it was containment. The servant bore the material consequences. The daughter bore the social ones, and the family bore the anxiety of wondering for years afterward whether anyone had noticed. The speed of the dismissal is one of the most consistent features of the historical accounts. Families did not deliberate at length once the situation was confirmed or sufficiently suspected. They acted immediately, because every day the servant remained in the house was another day of potential complication. He was gone, typically within 24 hours of the discovery, sometimes within hours. His possessions were returned to him, his wages calculated to the day, and he was out of the house before the household had fully registered that anything unusual had happened. There was no conversation between the servant and the family's daughter. There was no opportunity for a farewell. There was simply, from her perspective, a presence that had been there and then was not there, removed as cleanly and completely as a piece of furniture that had been taken out to be repaired and never brought back. The daughter's removal was handled with slightly more ceremony because she required a narrative. She could not simply disappear overnight without explanation. She was visiting her aunt. She was benefiting from a change of air. Her health had been a little uncertain, and the family had thought a spell in a different county might do her good. These explanations were delivered with the specific composure of people who have decided on a story and are committed to it, and they were usually accepted by the social circle without much visible scrutiny, not because everyone believed them, but because everyone understood that this was the format in which such situations were managed, and declining to scrutinize was the socially correct response. What the accounts rarely capture is the interior experience of the daughter in the days immediately following the discovery. The servant gone, her own removal imminent, the family conversation presumably conducted in the controlled register of people who are furious and frightened, and expressing both as a kind of cold, compressed disappointment. There are a few diary entries from this specific period, the hours and days after a situation was discovered and handled, and they share a quality of stunned compression, as though the writer had temporarily run out of the language required to process what was happening. The elaborate internal argument of the preceding weeks or months had resolved suddenly and externally, and what was left was not the relief of resolution but something considerably flatter and harder. Most cross-class attachments in Regency England were handled privately, contained within the family, and never made it into public record. But some did. The ones that escaped into the newspapers, the elopements, the court cases, the dramatic public departures, were the ones that became cautionary tales, repeated in drawing rooms and referenced in letters for years afterward. An elopement between a gentlewoman and a footman in 1809 was reported in at least 3 London papers, with the names partially obscured but the social details intact, the county, the family's rank, the manner of departure at 3 a.m. in the family's own carriage. The story had everything required for maximum social damage: class transgression, female agency, and a carriage. It was discussed for years. It is in its own way still being discussed now. The newspaper coverage of Regency scandal operated under a set of conventions that were, by modern standards, both more and less restrained than contemporary tabloid journalism. Names were frequently withheld, or replaced with initials, or partly obscured, but the surrounding details were given with enough specificity that anyone in the relevant social circle could identify exactly who was being discussed. This was not an oversight, it was the format. The partial concealment gave the newspapers a degree of legal protection, while ensuring that the story reached precisely the audience most interested in it. A report of an elopement involving a young lady of good family in a northern county, and a member of her father's domestic establishment, told anyone who needed to know everything they needed to know, while technically not naming names. The cases that made the papers tended to share certain features. They were usually the ones that had involved some element of drama, an actual departure from the house, a pursuit, a confrontation, a legal proceeding. The quiet situations, handled internally and resolved without incident, left no public record because there was nothing for the newspapers to report. What made it to print was the failure of containment, the situation that had escalated beyond the family's ability to manage it privately, that had involved third parties, that had generated the kind of visible disruption that created witnesses. A family that managed a situation cleanly left nothing for the papers. A family that was caught off guard, or whose daughter moved faster than anyone anticipated, or whose servant had connections that complicated a clean dismissal, those were the cases that escaped. What is notable about the cases that did make the papers is how they were framed. The language consistently centered the social transgression rather than the human situation. The story was not about two people with feelings. It was about a breach of the social order, a violation of category, a young woman who had done something that required the newspaper to use words like imprudent and regrettable, and much to the distress of her family. The servant, where mentioned at all, was a figure of moral hazard, the agent of disruption rather than a participant with his own interior life. He was not a person in the newspaper's account. He was a category error walking around in livery. This framing was not accidental. It was how the readership of the papers understood the situation, and the papers gave them what they understood. Whether 2 centuries of distance gives us a better view is, perhaps, the more interesting question. In the cases where a gentlewoman and servant did marry, and they did occasionally, in full knowledge of the consequences, the result was a life that fell between 2 worlds and comfortably into neither. The woman's family usually severed contact, at least initially. Her former social circle was closed. The man elevated to the legal status of a gentleman's husband, but without the income, education, or social connections that status implied, often found himself in a peculiar limbo. Life in the country was possible, quieter, more isolated, away from the social machinery that had excluded them. Some accounts suggest these marriages were genuinely happy. Others describe a slow, grinding slide into financial difficulty and social isolation that the romantic feelings of 17 had not quite anticipated. The practical reality of cross-class marriage in 1813 was that love by itself did not pay the butcher. The financial situation of a couple in this position deserves specific attention, because it was the thing that most reliably separated the romantic version of the story from the lived one. A gentlewoman who married a servant gave up, in most cases, access to her family's money. Depending on the terms of any settlements or inheritance, she might retain some income, a small annuity, the income from a modest capital sum. But she had no claim to the family estate, no expectation of further financial support, and no access to the network of connections through which money, property, and opportunity typically moved in Regency England. Her husband, meanwhile, had his wages, if he found work, and whatever he had saved. The combined financial position of a couple formed in this way was, in most cases, significantly reduced from what either of them had separately expected their adult lives to look like. The physical reality of the life they then built together was shaped by this reduction. The house was smaller. The servants, a bitter irony, were absent. Work was necessary in ways it had not been before. A woman who had been raised with housemaids and cooks found herself managing a household with her own hands, which was not impossible. Many women managed this transition, but which was also a daily reminder of the distance travelled from the life she had previously occupied. Her husband, accustomed to domestic service, was in some ways better practically equipped for this life than she was. He could cook. He knew how a house worked. The inversion of their respective domestic competencies was one of the smaller, persistent strangeness of their new arrangement. What the accounts of these marriages also show is that the social isolation was not always permanent. Time had a way of eroding the sharpest edges of family disapproval, particularly when children arrived. A grandmother who had severed contact with her daughter sometimes found, 5 years later, that the grandchildren were a more compelling argument for partial reconciliation than the original transgression was for permanent estrangement. Not always, but sometimes. The arc of these relationships with the family of origin was usually not a clean break followed by permanent silence. It was a messy, fluctuating process of gradual thaw, occasional relapse, and eventual, partial, carefully unacknowledged normalization. The marriage that had scandalized everyone in 1816 was, by 1830, just something that had happened. History, in individual families as in nations, has a strong tendency to become the past rather than the present, and eventually almost everything becomes the past. For every gentlewoman who acted on her feelings, there were dozens who didn't, who recognized a situation, experienced it fully, and then chose, with various degrees of reluctance and grief, to do nothing. These women are harder to find in the historical record, precisely because they were successful at suppression. But they appear in diaries as sudden gaps, unexplained silences, entries that shift from the specific and detailed to the generic and composed. A servant is mentioned, then not mentioned, then mentioned again weeks later in a single neutral line. A woman takes a different route on her morning walk. A position within the household is quietly reorganized so that the specific person appears less frequently. The discipline required for this, carried out in private without acknowledgement, without anyone to discuss it with, was extraordinary. The Regency gentlewoman who kept her feelings to herself and got on with her life was, in her own way, performing a feat of emotional endurance that the romance novels consistently fail to appreciate. The decision to walk away, if decision is even the right word for a process that was more like a sustained daily choice, renewed over weeks and months, required a specific kind of self-management that the Regency period had, somewhat inadvertently, trained women quite well for. The entire apparatus of female conduct in this era was built around the regulation of feeling. You did not display anger. You did not express opinions that would make a room uncomfortable. You contained, moderated, managed, presented the composed surface that the social world required. This training, applied to an unwanted attachment, was at least partially effective. The same discipline that kept you pleasant at dinner when you were miserable kept you walking past the garden at the safe time of day, rather than the inconvenient one. The skills transferred. It was not comfortable, but it worked. What the diaries suggest is that the walking away was rarely a single moment of resolution. It was not a scene in which the woman looked at the situation clearly, made a decisive choice, and proceeded into a clean future. It was instead a repeated, effortful, daily process of choosing not to act on the feeling, of redirecting attention, of deliberately occupying the mind with other things. The Regency gentlewoman who successfully suppressed an attachment typically threw herself into the available alternatives with something approaching ferocity. More needlework, more music practice, more morning calls, more correspondence, more of the social duties that normally occupied a variable amount of attention, but now needed to occupy all of it. Busyness as emotional management, distraction as discipline. It is not a glamorous strategy. It is also a remarkably effective one, and the women who employed it left behind lives that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. The extraordinary thing was invisible, because they had made it invisible. That was the point. It would be strange to spend a significant amount of time on Regency cross-class romance without acknowledging that the woman who understood Regency social dynamics better than almost anyone was writing novels about it in real time. Jane Austen did not write directly about gentlewomen and servants. Her social radar was too precise for that kind of structural explicitness. But the architecture of her novels is built on exactly the same anxieties. Who is socially acceptable? Who is not? What happens when a woman's feelings exceed her social permissions? What does it cost to want the wrong person? Emma Woodhouse's blind spots about class. The Dashwood sisters' financial vulnerability, the entire plot mechanism of Sense and Sensibility, which is fundamentally about what happens when a woman's emotional responses refuse to cooperate with her social circumstances. Austen never wrote a footman into a love story, but she wrote everything around one, and her readers, then and now, knew exactly what was being implied. Austen's genius, in the context of what we're discussing tonight, was partly the genius of precise social placement. She understood exactly where the lines were, which meant she understood exactly how much she could approach them without crossing. Her heroes, Darcy, Wentworth, Knightley, are always, just barely, on the acceptable side of the class boundary. Darcy is rich and landed. His problem is pride, not rank. Wentworth is a naval officer. His income is uncertain, but his profession is honourable. Knightley is a gentleman farmer of the most unimpeachable respectability. None of them is a servant. None of them is a groom or a footman or a head gardener. And yet the social anxiety around each of them, the question of whether he is acceptable, whether he is the right kind of person for the heroine to want, maps so precisely onto the actual social landscape of the period that it clearly spoke to readers who were navigating real versions of these distinctions. The character in Austen who comes closest to the situation we're discussing is not a romantic hero at all. It is someone like William Price in Mansfield Park, Fanny's brother, a naval rating working his way up through a service career, whose social position is genuinely precarious, and whose prospects depend entirely on the patronage of those above him. Austen treats him with warmth and dignity. She does not romanticize his position, but she takes it seriously as a human situation. The gap between his world and the world of Mansfield Park is real, and Austen neither pretends it isn't there nor pretends it makes him less of a person. This was, in its quiet way, a more radical position than the novels get credit for. What Austen also understood, and built into the structure of her novels rather than stating directly, was the cost of wanting the wrong person. Marianne Dashwood, who wants Willoughby and is nearly destroyed by it, is not punished for her feelings. She is educated by them. The novel's argument is not that Marianne was wrong to feel. It is that feeling, without the governing intelligence of sense, leads to devastation. This is not the same as saying feelings should be suppressed. It is saying that feelings exist in a social world that has real consequences, and navigating that world requires both the feeling and the intelligence, which is, if you think about it, exactly the situation that every gentlewoman in a Regency household was managing, whether she was managing it in the pages of a novel or in the actual garden on an actual Tuesday morning in 1816. Regency country houses were architecturally designed to separate the social classes living within them. Servants had their own staircases, their own entrances, their own dining arrangements, their own world operating in parallel to the one above. The back stairs existed precisely so that a footman could carry coals to a bedroom without passing through the corridor where the family moved. The kitchen was below and behind. The servants' hall was its own domain. This physical separation was not accidental. It was the architectural expression of a social philosophy built into the house itself. And what it meant in practice was that any breach of the spatial arrangement, a gentleman's daughter in the kitchen, a stable hand in the garden corridor, two people on the same staircase at the wrong hour was already, by its nature, a transgression. The house was the rule. Violating the spatial code was, in miniature, a violation of the entire social order. The architecture of the Regency country house was a masterpiece of social engineering, and it is worth spending a moment actually visualizing it, because it makes the subsequent transgressions considerably more comprehensible. The main house, the family's house, was designed around visibility and circulation. Wide corridors, well-lit rooms, a layout that facilitated the kind of social movement that country house life required. Guests arriving, morning calls paid, evening entertainments organised, the family moving between spaces in patterns that were semi-public and constantly observable. This was the designed social space. And then, running through the same building like a shadow version of it, was the servants' infrastructure, narrow back staircases, basement corridors, service passages that allowed the household to function without the function being visible. The coal arrived, the laundry moved, the meals appeared. None of it was supposed to be seen, and the architecture made not seeing structurally easy. The stables occupied a particular position in this geography because they were simultaneously part of the estate and physically separate from the main house. The stable yard was a working environment, loud and practical and smelling of horses and leather and hay, and it was also a space where the family came, because the family owned horses and needed to interact with the staff who managed them. This meant the stables were one of the places where the social separation built into the main house architecture broke down somewhat. You could not send a footman to collect your horse. You went yourself, or you sent your daughter, and your daughter arrived in the stable yard, which was the head groom's domain, and the head groom was there, and the architecture could not help you now. The drawing room and the stable represented in miniature the two poles of the social world we're discussing. The drawing room was where social performance happened, where the rules were most visible, most enforced, most supported by the physical environment. The stable was where the rules were structurally harder to maintain, where the physical environment required practical interaction, where the social performance had less infrastructure to lean on. It is not a coincidence that so many of the accounts of cross-class attachments involve outdoor spaces, stables, gardens, grounds. The house itself was built to prevent them. The spaces outside the house were not, and human feelings, given the choice, have always found their way toward the places with the least surveillance. They are very reliable that way. A lady's maid who discovered that her mistress had formed an attachment was placed in an almost impossibly difficult position. She owed loyalty to her mistress, years of intimate service, of dressing and undressing, of listening and keeping confidences, created a genuine bond that was not easily set aside. But she also owed her employment to the family. Reporting what she knew might destroy her mistress's life. Keeping the secret made her complicit in something that could, if discovered, destroy her own. Ladies' maids in this situation made different choices. Some kept quiet for years, carrying the knowledge alone. Some reported what they knew, occasionally framed as concern for their mistress rather than betrayal. Some found themselves dismissed along with the servant, collateral damage in the family's clean-up operation. The lady's maid who navigated this correctly, who kept the secret, maintained her position, and carried the knowledge to her grave, was performing a remarkable act of tightrope walking across a very long career. The lady's maid's position in any household depended on a specific combination of competence and discretion. She was good at her job, the practical skills of dressing, hairdressing, managing the mistress's wardrobe, handling the logistics of travel and social engagements. But she was also, crucially, silent about what she knew. A lady's maid who talked was a lady's maid who would not be employed for long, and the reputation for discretion was both the entry requirement for the position and the condition of remaining in it. This meant that ladies' maids were, as a professional class, extraordinarily practiced at carrying knowledge that was not theirs to share. They knew about health conditions, they knew about family finances, they knew about the marriage that was less than it appeared from the outside and the children who were more difficult than the household admitted. Discretion was not a special effort for them. It was the default mode of the job. What made an attachment different from these other categories of professional confidence was the active nature of the secret. The maid who knew that her mistress had a difficult marriage was keeping a passive secret. She was simply not discussing something she had observed. The maid who knew that her mistress was exchanging notes with a footman was keeping an active secret. She was maintaining a fiction, daily, in the face of family members who were her employers and who would consider themselves deceived if they knew what she was not telling them. The distinction mattered. Passive discretion was part of the job. Active complicity was something more, and the maid who crossed into it did so knowing that if the situation came to light, her position was gone regardless of what she had done or not done. She had been present. She had known. In the family's account, that was enough. What is most striking about the maids who kept these secrets, looking at the historical record, is how many of them did it not out of blackmail potential or self-interest, but out of something that looks very much like genuine loyalty. The intimacy of the ladies-maid relationship was real. Years of daily physical proximity, of being trusted with the private person behind the social performance, created bonds that did not dissolve easily in the face of competing institutional pressures. The maid who kept the secret was, in many cases, keeping it for the same reason she had kept all the other secrets, because her mistress had trusted her with it, and that trust meant something. It was perhaps the most human element in the whole arrangement, loyalty to a person, operating quietly against the interests of an institution. It didn't always end well, but it was, in its own way, entirely understandable. History tends to focus on the lady's perspective in these stories, because the lady left more written records. But the servants had views too, expressed in letters, recorded in accounts, captured occasionally by writers sympathetic to the working class. The general consensus below stairs on the subject of a mistress developing feelings for a member of staff was complicated, uncomfortable, and rarely ending well for anyone. A footman who was the object of his employer's daughter's attention was not, in most accounts, thrilled. He was exposed. His employment was suddenly conditional on managing a situation he had not created and could not easily resolve. The other servants watched. They noticed. They talked about it in the kitchen in the evenings, with the particular relish that humans have always brought to situations that are simultaneously scandalous and entirely predictable. The household gossip network was efficient and merciless, and it did not require anyone to do anything dramatic before it had already formed its conclusions. The below-stairs community of a large Regency household was, in many respects, a village unto itself. People lived together, worked together, ate together, and had very little privacy from each other. In a servants' hall shared by a dozen people, the idea of a secret was largely theoretical. Everyone knew when the first footman had been reprimanded. Everyone knew when the cook was having a difficult week. Everyone knew, with remarkable speed and accuracy, when something unusual was developing between a member of the household staff and someone from the family upstairs. It was not that anyone was particularly nosy, though some were. It was that the shared physical space made observation unavoidable. You noticed things. You mentioned them to the person next to you at supper, and the person next to you at supper mentioned them to someone else, and by the end of the week the entire below-stairs world had assembled the picture from its component parts and formed an opinion about it. The opinion was rarely straightforward admiration. The romantic view of cross-class attachment, the idea that it represented a beautiful challenge to an unjust system, that love triumphantly ignored the artificial barriers of rank, was not, in general, the below-stairs view. The below-stairs view was considerably more practical. If the situation became known to the family, the servant involved lost his position. If the situation developed into something scandalous, the entire household suffered, increased scrutiny from the family, possible reorganization of staff, a general atmosphere of suspicion and tension that made the working environment considerably less comfortable. The footman who had attracted the wrong attention was not a romantic figure to his colleagues. He was a liability a problem that had arrived in their shared domestic space and was making everyone's professional life more precarious. There was also a class dimension within the servant world that the romantic narrative ignores entirely. Servants had their own social pride. A lady's maid who had spent years building a reputation for impeccable discretion and professional excellence didn't want her household associated with scandal. A butler who ran his domain with the quiet efficiency of a well-maintained clock didn't want the family's daughter creating a situation that would bring journalists, gossip, and the family's agitated attention into his carefully ordered world. The senior servants, particularly, had invested significantly in the respectability of their households because the household's reputation was their professional credential. A scandal was not just the family's problem, it was everyone's problem, and the below-stairs world knew it. What the servants' accounts do occasionally reveal, however, is sympathy, directed, interestingly, less often at the footman in the middle of the situation than at the lady. The footman, from below stairs, was viewed with a mixture of concern and exasperation. He should have been more careful. He should have made himself less visible. Whatever the circumstances, he should have found a way to make the situation not happen. The lady, by contrast, was sometimes viewed with something closer to genuine pity, a young woman trapped in a social structure that gave her almost no autonomy, no real choices, no outlet for the parts of herself that the drawing room did not have room for. The servants understood constraint. They lived inside it every day, and the gentlewoman's gilded version of it was, to the more perceptive among them, not so different in its essential experience from their own. Regency England's particular horror at cross-class attachment was not universal. Other European cultures navigated the same human dynamics with different levels of pragmatism. In parts of continental Europe, particularly in certain aristocratic circles in France and the German states, a nobleman keeping a mistress of lower social rank was essentially institutionalized. The rules around it were different, the stigma distributed differently. For women, the calculus was less forgiving across Europe generally. Female transgression carried higher cost than male transgression in most contexts. But the specific English combination of Protestant moral architecture, rigid class feeling, and the particular social terror of the nouveau gentry, who had only recently arrived at respectability, produced a uniquely intense reaction to any suggestion of class mixing. England in 1815 was not just uncomfortable with cross-class attachment, it was, specifically, unusually, almost professionally uncomfortable with it. Which is, of course, why it makes such good historical material. The French comparison is particularly instructive, because France and England spent the Regency period in a state of mutual fascination and mutual contempt that made comparisons between their social customs a lively and contentious genre all by itself. The French aristocratic tradition had, for centuries, operated with a pragmatism about the gap between official morality and actual behaviour that the English found simultaneously appalling and secretly enviable. The maîtresse en titre, the official mistress of a French king or nobleman, was a recognised social category, a position with its own protocols, its own precedents, its own understood set of rules. The mistress of Louis XV held a court position. She had apartments at Versailles. She was received. She was not, in the English sense, ruined. She was, in the French sense, placed. The social architecture had made room for the human reality, rather than pretending the human reality didn't exist. This was not, it should be said, a system that was particularly good for women. The French arrangement was pragmatic about male desire, and systematically indifferent to the wishes of the women involved. A woman installed as a nobleman's mistress was not there because she had successfully asserted her emotional autonomy. She was there because a powerful man had chosen her, and the social system had built him a comfortable framework for the choice. The English system, for all its hypocrisy, at least maintained the official position that women's virtue was worth protecting. The French system was honest about the fact that men's desires would be accommodated and considerably less interested in what anyone else thought about it. The German states offered yet another variation. The smaller German courts of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were, in many cases, genuinely less rigid about class boundaries in romantic matters than either the French or the English systems, partly because the aristocracy of these states was sufficiently small and sufficiently close to the professional and merchant classes that the boundaries were harder to maintain in practice. Accounts from German noble families of the period describe marriages across what the English would have considered insurmountable class lines, with a matter-of-factness that would have made a Regency mother reach for her smelling salts. Not without consequence, not without social friction, but without the absolute, total, unappealable quality of the English version of ruin. The English gentlewoman reading accounts of continental social customs, when she was allowed to read them, might have found them either reassuringly decadent or quietly, dangerously appealing. Probably both, depending on the week. Not all cross-class attachments ended in either dramatic elopement or clean resolution. Some of them simply continued, ambiguously, uncomfortably for months or years, with neither party willing to act and neither willing to withdraw. A servant remains in a position somewhat longer than employment logic would suggest. A lady continues to take her walks at the hour she knows certain work will be underway in the garden. Nothing happens, nothing is said. Both parties understand everything and neither acknowledges any of it, and the household operates around this shared fiction with the specific English skill for pretending that nothing is occurring while everything is. These arrangements, not quite attachments, not quite nothing, were probably the most common outcome of all. The feelings existed. They were never acted on. They gradually subsided or were suppressed or outlasted themselves. And everyone involved grew older and moved on, and nobody wrote about it, and it quietly disappeared into the vast unrecorded middle of history. This slow drift is the hardest category of Regency cross-class attachment to find in the historical record, precisely because it generated no events. Events are what the record is made of. An elopement generates newspaper reports, family correspondence, legal documents. A dismissal generates household accounts, letters of explanation, the paper trail of consequence. But a long, unacknowledged, mutually understood situation that simply continued, without resolution, for 2 or 3 years, and then gradually ceased to be the same situation as the feelings faded or the circumstances changed, left almost nothing. A few diary entries with a consistent name appearing at regular intervals, a gap where the name stops appearing. Nothing that would strike a reader as significant without the context of everything that had come before. These situations had their own particular texture, distinct from both the suppressed attachment and the acted upon one. The woman was not pretending the feeling did not exist. She was aware of it. It was present. It shaped the daily calendar and the direction of morning walks. But she was also not acting on it. She occupied a kind of suspended middle state, where the feeling was acknowledged internally and acted upon in tiny, deniable ways. The walk taken at the strategic hour, the glance held slightly too long, the conversation that went just slightly further than necessity required, without ever crossing into the territory that would constitute a real transgression. It was, in its own way, a form of relationship. Not a normal one, not a satisfying one, but a real thing, shared between two people who both understood it and neither named it. The servant in this arrangement was managing a slightly different version of the same situation. He understood what was happening. He was not obtuse. A man employed in a genteel household developed, of professional necessity, a finely calibrated social intelligence, and the ability to read a room or a garden or a stable yard with accuracy was part of the job. He knew, and he too occupied the suspended middle state, neither withdrawing so completely that the situation resolved nor advancing in any way that would constitute a genuine step. It was a performance of not knowing sustained by two people simultaneously, and the energy required to maintain it day after day across the shared domestic space of a country house was quietly enormous. The miracle was not that these situations eventually ended, it was that they lasted as long as they did. When a servant was dismissed for attracting the wrong kind of attention from a family's daughter, the practical consequences were significant and largely invisible to the family that dismissed him. Without a character reference, the written recommendation from an employer that was essentially the period equivalent of a CV, it was nearly impossible to find comparable employment in another respectable household. He might find work in a less prestigious establishment, or in trade, or leave domestic service entirely. Some left for the cities, where anonymity made reinvention possible. Some emigrated. The colonies absorbed a significant number of men whose British lives had become untenable. A few found their way into accounts that have survived. Brief mentions in letters of a former servant now working in some reduced capacity, or encountered unexpectedly years later in a different city, in different circumstances. The dismissal that the family experienced as a clean resolution of a difficult situation was, for the servant, the beginning of a considerably harder chapter. The character reference was the central mechanism of a domestic servant's professional life, and its absence was not a minor inconvenience. It was a professional death sentence of the most practical kind. When a new household received an application from a servant, the first question was always about the previous position. Who had they worked for how long, and what did that employer say about them? A servant who had left a previous position without a reference, or worse, who admitted to having been dismissed, was immediately suspect. The domestic service world was smaller and more networked than it might appear from the outside. Butlers knew other butlers, housekeepers corresponded. The families who employed servants moved in overlapping social circles, and a servant's reputation moved through those circles with some efficiency. The man dismissed from a good house for reasons that were not specified, but were understood, was going to find the doors of comparable houses closed. The city was the standard solution to this problem, and London in particular absorbed the casualties of rural domestic service dismissals with the impersonal efficiency of a very large city. In London, you could find work that did not require a character reference. Labouring work, trade work, the lower ranks of the commercial world that were less concerned with your previous employer's opinion of your moral character and more concerned with whether you could do the job. Some men made this transition successfully and rebuilt something workable in the urban economy. Others did not, and slid into the lower strata of city life with the particular velocity of someone who had started from a position of precarity and received a significant downward push. What the family's account never contains is a follow-up. The servant was dismissed, the situation was resolved, and the narrative moved on without him. He was not part of the story's next chapter from the family's perspective, because he had been removed from the story. The household closed around his absence. Someone else was hired. The rhythms of domestic life resumed. And somewhere else, in a different city, or a different county, or eventually a different country, the man who had been the footman, or the gardener, or the groom in someone's interrupted story was continuing his own, without the benefit of anyone recording it. The asymmetry of the historical record, the volume of material generated by the family, the near silence around the servant, is itself a kind of historical argument about whose experience was considered worth preserving. Among the stories that ended well, or at least ended in a way that allowed a life to continue, there are accounts of women who found a path through the social wreckage and arrived at something resembling contentment, usually far from their original social world, usually in reduced financial circumstances, usually in the company of a man who had been, by any previous measure of their life, entirely the wrong person. These women are not celebrated in the history books. They do not appear in the peerage. Their children were not presented at court. But some of them, by the evidence of letters and occasional journal entries, lived with a particular kind of quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from having chosen, at considerable cost, to live according to feeling rather than expectation. They had been written off. Some of them seemed not to have minded. They had crossed a line that their world insisted could not be crossed, and found, on the other side, that it was still possible to get up in the morning and have breakfast and find the day worth living, which is not the grand romantic ending, but is arguably the more interesting one. The accounts of women who made cross-class marriages work, genuinely work, in the sense of producing a functional, reasonably contented life, rather than a romantic disaster, share certain features. Adaptability is the most consistent. The women who managed the transition from genteel life to something considerably less comfortable and more self-reliant were the ones who approached the practical demands of the new life as problems to be solved rather than indignities to be endured. The woman who had never cooked a meal learned to cook. The woman who had never managed a household budget without the mediation of a housekeeper learned the actual cost of things. These were not small adjustments. They were significant recalibrations of daily reality, and they required a flexibility of identity that not everyone could manage. The geographic dimension was also significant. The women who made it work tended to make it work somewhere new. The village where everyone knew who they were and who they had been was not the right environment for a quiet reinvention. Distance helped. A new county, a new town, a new community that had no prior knowledge of the family name or the circumstances of departure. This was the space in which a different life became possible. In a new place, you were simply who you currently were. The woman who arrived in a small market town as the wife of a man who had found work as a land agent or a shopkeeper or a minor tradesman was not, to her new neighbours, a fallen gentlewoman who had married her footman. She was simply a respectable married woman, and respectability, it turned out, was portable. It could be rebuilt. It just had to be rebuilt somewhere that the original version was not already established. The marriages themselves, in the accounts that survive, seem to have been characterized less by grand passion than by a specific kind of mutual respect and practical partnership. The romantic feeling that had initiated the situation was frequently replaced over time by something quieter and arguably more sustaining. The daily reality of two people managing a life together, solving the practical problems that presented themselves, building something that was theirs rather than hers or his. It was not the life she'd been raised to expect. It was frequently smaller, harder, and less comfortable. But it was chosen, and the choosing, in a world that had offered women almost no choices at all, was not a negligible thing. One of the less documented but extensively practiced arts of Regency family life was the retroactive rewriting of uncomfortable events. A daughter who had been sent to a relative's house was said to be visiting for her health. A servant who had been dismissed was described as having sought a position elsewhere. A broken engagement, sometimes the direct result of a scandal that had been quietly managed, was explained as a mutual and amicable decision. Families were remarkably skilled at this. Letters were written, visits were made. The story was circulated in its corrected form before the incorrect form had a chance to solidify. And in a society where information moved by letter and by word of mouth, and where the people who controlling letter writing and social calls were precisely the people managing the narrative, it could actually work. The revised version became, over time, the only version. The original disappeared, and the daughter who had nearly ruined everything settled, eventually into a life that looked, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. The speed with which a Regency family could construct and circulate a revised narrative was, in its own way, impressive. The communication technology of the period, letters delivered by post or by hand, morning calls paid in person, the social circulation of news through the established channels of neighbourhood and connection was slow by modern standards, which meant that a family that moved quickly could get ahead of the story. If you could reach the relevant people with the correct version before the incorrect version arrived, the correct version won. This was not always possible. Sometimes the story escaped before the management began, but in many cases the family that acted within hours, that wrote the letters, paid the calls, established the narrative, succeeded in shaping what was known and what was not. The architecture of the revised story was usually simple. It did not attempt too much. The most effective cover narratives were the ones that required the least elaboration: a health visit, a change of air, a mutual agreement, because the simplest story was the least vulnerable to the kind of scrutiny that complex stories invited. A family that over-explained created questions. A family that offered a brief, plausible account and then moved briskly on to other subjects gave the social circle very little to work with. The social circle, for its part, generally cooperated, not because everyone believed the story, but because the polite fiction of believing it was the socially correct response, and the Regency social world was extremely committed to doing the socially correct thing. What the narrative management also required, and what it was very careful to produce, was the ongoing normal behaviour of all parties. A family in crisis that continued attending assemblies, paying calls, receiving visitors and performing the social routines of respectable life was a family that was, publicly, not in crisis. The performance of normalcy was the most convincing evidence that nothing unusual had occurred. And since genteel families were already practiced performers, the entire apparatus of Regency social life was a sustained collective performance. This was not technically a new skill. It was simply the existing skill applied to a more urgent situation. The daughter appeared at the appropriate events. She was pleasant. She was composed. She wore the correct things. She gave no indication in any public setting that anything had changed. And gradually, because social memory is shorter than social anxiety implies, the episode receded. Time did what narrative management could only begin. It made things simply part of the past. A gentlewoman who decided to marry a servant faced not only social obstacles but legal ones. The Marriage Act of 1753 required that marriages be conducted by the Church of England, with banns read publicly in the parish church for 3 consecutive Sundays before the ceremony, which meant that anyone in the community had 3 weeks' worth of advance notice and opportunity to object. This was not an accident. The public announcement was partly designed to prevent exactly the kind of marriage we're discussing, the hasty, secret, socially inconvenient union that a family would have prevented if they had known in time. Elopements to Scotland, specifically to Gretna Green, just over the Scottish border, were one response, since Scottish law required only a declaration before witnesses. The journey to Scotland took time, however, and a pursuing family with a fast carriage could, and sometimes did, intercept the couple before they arrived. The logistics of running away from Regency England were, in other words, genuinely complicated, and the romance novels have always been fairly vague on this point. The ban system deserves specific attention because it was one of the most elegant pieces of social control ever built into English law. 3 consecutive Sundays in the local parish church, the names of the couple intending to marry were read aloud to the assembled congregation. Anyone who knew of a legal impediment to the marriage was invited to declare it. The practical effect of this requirement was that a marriage could not be secret, at least not locally. Everyone who attended church, which, in a Regency village, was essentially everyone, heard the names. The names travelled. They reached the family within days, which was, from the legal architecture's perspective, entirely the point. The system was not designed to prevent marriage. It was designed to prevent marriage without community knowledge, which amounted to the same thing in the situation we're discussing. A special license offered one alternative, a document issued by the Archbishop of Canterbury that permitted marriage without banns, at any time and in any place. Special licenses were expensive, relatively difficult to obtain, and required giving a reason for the application. They were used by the aristocracy for marriages that needed to happen quickly, for various respectable reasons. They were also, theoretically, available to anyone who could pay the fee and navigate the ecclesiastical bureaucracy. In practice, the process was slow enough and visible enough that it was not a clean solution for a situation requiring speed and secrecy. The couple who applied for a special license was a couple that had already created a paper trail. Gretna Green was the famous solution, and it was famous for exactly the reasons that made families terrified of it. It worked. The Scottish border was approximately 300 miles from London, which meant a journey of several days by carriage. A couple that left in the middle of the night with enough of a head start could reach Scotland before a pursuing family could organise and close the gap. The race to Gretna Green was not a romantic fiction. It happened with sufficient regularity that it generated its own legal responses. Later legislation attempted to close the loophole, and the blacksmith shop at Gretna Green became one of the most famous locations in England precisely because of what it represented. The place where the English legal architecture ran out, and two people could simply declare themselves married. The families who rode north in pursuit of their daughters understood exactly what they were racing against. So did the daughters who had chosen to run. Women who lived through Regency England into Victorian old age occasionally left late-life accounts, memoirs, letters to grandchildren, final diary entries that reflected on earlier decades with a candour that the social constraints of their youth had not permitted. Some of these accounts contain, buried in reminiscence about dresses and dances and the social architecture of a vanished world, brief and vivid references to feelings that were never acted on, attachments that were suppressed, choices that were made in one direction when the heart pointed in another. An elderly woman writing in 1870 about a youth in 1815 had the benefit of distance and occasionally used it. Not to justify, the Victorian moral framework was in many ways stricter than the Regency one, but simply to acknowledge that it had happened, that she had felt something, that it had been real, that she had chosen differently. The acknowledgement made in old age had a particular quality, neither regret exactly nor pride, but a kind of precise, unsentimental record of having been fully human in a world that discouraged it. The late-life memoir is a different document from the diary kept in the moment. The moment diary was written under the pressure of ongoing events, with the outcome still uncertain and the social consequences still immediate. The old age memoir was written from a position of safety. The choices had been made, the consequences had been lived through. The social machinery that had once felt so omnipotent had largely ceased to operate on a woman in her 70s. The people who would have cared most about the revelations were, in many cases, dead. The world that had made certain feelings so costly had shifted significantly over the intervening decades, and the woman writing in old age had, at last, the freedom to say simply what had happened, without the elaborate management of disclosure that had been required for most of her life. What these late-life accounts share is a particular tone, reflective, slightly detached, with the quality of someone describing events that feel both very far away and oddly specific. The details remembered across 50 years are telling. Not the grand social occasions, not the seasons in London, not the assemblies and the carriages and the parties. Those appear, but lightly. What appears with the sharper focus of genuine memory is the particular morning, the specific garden, the name that had not been spoken aloud in decades. The feeling, remembered across 50 years, with the slightly startled quality of something that has not lost its original shape. Time had done many things to these women. It had not apparently entirely dissolved the memory of having wanted something they had not been permitted to want. The Victorian context added its own layer of complexity to these late-life accounts. The Victorian moral framework was, in some respects, considerably more elaborate in its disapproval of transgression than the Regency one had been. And yet the women writing in Victorian old age about Regency youth were navigating something more complicated than simple social disapproval. They were navigating the specific experience of having outlived the world that had imposed the restrictions of sitting in a Victorian drawing room, surrounded by Victorian propriety, and understanding with perfect clarity that the social rules that had shaped the most important decisions of their lives were not eternal laws but historical conventions, specific to a time and place now partly dissolved. That understanding did not come cheap. It was available only to those who had lived long enough to watch the world change around the choices they had been unable to avoid making. For some of them, the understanding arrived with peace. For others, with something considerably more complicated. In the cases where a cross-class attachment produced a marriage, and that marriage produced children, the question of what happened to those children is quietly fascinating. Born into a social position that was genuinely ambiguous, neither the gentry their mother came from nor the servant class their father had been. They occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. Some families eventually reconciled, particularly if a grandmother softened in old age or a sibling remained privately sympathetic, and the children were occasionally absorbed cautiously back into some version of respectable connection. Others were simply outside. They grew up in reduced circumstances, sometimes acutely aware of the social world their mother had given up, sometimes largely indifferent to it. A handful, by the mid-Victorian period, had found their own paths to respectability through commerce, the professions, or marriage to people who did not know or did not care about the genealogy. They arrived at the same destination their mother's original social world had occupied, by a much longer route and with a considerably more interesting family history. The children of these unions inherited a specific social ambiguity that manifested differently depending on what the parents had managed to build. If the marriage had landed in a new place, among people with no prior knowledge of the family history, the children grew up without the stigma attaching to them personally. They were simply the children of the people they appeared to be, which was a moderately respectable family of middling means. The family history was, in this case, something the children might know and not discuss, or might not know at all, depending on what the parents had chosen to tell them. Some couples, starting over in a new location, simply did not tell their children. The mother had been born somewhere else. The family had come to this town some years ago. There was no further elaboration. The children grew up with a vague family background and no particular reason to investigate it. The children who grew up knowing were in a more complicated position. Awareness of the family history, of the grandfather who had severed contact, of the social world the mother had left, of the specific nature of the transgression that had occasioned all of this, created a set of psychological adjustments that each child made differently. Some were angry at the grandfather or at the social system that had made the original choice so costly. Some were fiercely loyal to the parents and the life they had built, taking a kind of pride in the originality of the family story. Some were simply sad, aware of a loss that was abstract to them personally but concrete in its ongoing effects on their circumstances and opportunities. The social world that had rejected their parents had also, by extension, reduced the inheritance of possibility that the children might otherwise have expected. The Victorian period's expansion of the professional middle class offered these children something that had not been available to their parents' generation, a path to respectability that did not require either birth or landed property. The law, medicine, commerce, the church, the civil service, these were routes through which a man of ability and application could arrive at a position of social standing that did not depend on the circumstances of his birth or the history of his parents' marriage. Several of the documented children of Regency cross-class unions found their way into exactly these professions. They became solicitors, doctors, clergy, merchants. They married into the professional class. They built lives that were, by the standards of their adult world, entirely respectable. Their grandmother's drawing room was closed to them. The drawing rooms of their own generation were not. History once again had moved. It generally does. 2 centuries later, the Regency cross-class romance has not lost its grip on the imagination, and it is worth asking why. Part of it is the period itself, the costumes, the drawing rooms, the specific social architecture that makes both the obstacle and the transgression feel clear and comprehensible. But underneath the period detail, the story being told is something more fundamental. It is a story about the collision between the person you're supposed to be and the person your feelings insist on making you. Between the social identity, daughter of, wife of, member of, and the internal experience that refuses to cooperate with the external requirements. Regency England made that collision exceptionally visible because its social rules were exceptionally explicit. But the underlying dynamic, the heart refusing the sensible option, the world insisting on the sensible option, and 2 people caught between them, is not historical. It is simply human. Which is probably why we are all still listening to it at 2 a.m. The specific appeal of the Regency setting for this particular story is that it externalizes the internal conflict. In the modern world, the obstacles to wanting the wrong person are largely psychological. The inner voices of self-doubt, family expectation, social anxiety, the accumulated weight of other people's opinions about what constitutes a reasonable life choice. These are real obstacles. They're not small, but they are invisible from the outside, and they are theoretically surmountable. The modern romantic narrative is complicated by the fact that the obstacles are soft and the permission, formally speaking, exists. You can want whoever you want. The consequences may be uncomfortable, but they are rarely the specific, concrete, total consequences of Regency England, where the social machinery would simply close around you and the doors would stop opening. The Regency version externalizes all of that. The obstacle is not the inner voice. The obstacle is the actual social world, made of actual rules, enforced by actual consequences. The collision is visible and dramatic and structurally clear, and this clarity, paradoxically, makes the emotional truth of it more accessible rather than less. You do not have to do any work to understand why this matters. The stakes are obvious. The cost is legible. The feeling of wanting something you're not supposed to want. In a world that has made the wanting dangerous, that is a feeling the drawing room version makes vivid in a way that the modern version, for all its technical freedom, sometimes does not. There is also something specific about what the Regency cross-class story says about women. It is, at its core, a story about a woman who has an interior life that her social world does not have room for. The gentlewoman who develops feelings for a servant is not, in the social world's account, supposed to have those feelings. She's supposed to want the appropriate suitor, marry the appropriate man, inhabit the appropriate life. The feelings that arrive without permission are the evidence that she is more than the role, that there is a person inside the social performance who has her own responses, her own perceptions, her own completely unauthorized interior experience. The Regency setting makes this visible in the specific way that extreme social constraint always makes the inner life more vivid, by contrast, by pressure, by the dramatic clarity of what is being denied. And perhaps that is why the story persists. Not because we are nostalgic for corsets and social ruin, not because we think the Regency world was better, or more romantic, or preferable in any practical sense to the world we inhabit now, but because the story it tells about feeling something real in a world that insists on the performance, about the cost of the heart refusing the sensible option, about two people finding each other across a gap that everything around them insists cannot be crossed. That story does not belong to 1815. It belongs to anyone who has ever wanted something they were not supposed to want, in a world that had opinions about it, which is, to varying degrees, most of us. Sleep well. And so, here we are, at the end of a very long evening in Regency England. You have spent several hours in drawing rooms and garden paths and stable yards and back staircases, in the company of women who wanted things they were not supposed to want and men who found themselves in situations nobody had prepared them for. You have watched the social machinery do what social machinery always does, grind forward without particular interest in the people caught inside it, producing its outcomes with the impersonal efficiency of a system that has been running long enough to mistake itself for nature. It was not a gentle world. It was precise and beautiful in its way, and it produced some of the finest novels in the English language precisely because the pressure it placed on human feeling was so intense that the feeling had nowhere to go but into art. But for the people living inside it, not reading about it, not watching it from a comfortable distance, but actually inhabiting the daily reality of it, it was a world of extraordinarily limited choices, particularly for women. The gentlewoman who felt something she was not supposed to feel had essentially three options: suppress it, act on it, and lose everything, or occupy the suspended middle ground of the long, slow drift, feeling it privately and performing normalcy publicly until one or the other exhausted itself. None of these options was comfortable. All of them required something. What is worth carrying with you as you settle into sleep tonight is not the scandal or the social ruin or the dramatic elopements at 3 a.m. What is worth carrying is the quieter thing underneath all of it. The women who suppressed their feelings and got on with their lives were not cold or unfeeling. They were disciplined, and the discipline cost them something real, and they paid it anyway because that was what the world they lived in required. The women who acted on their feelings and lost their social worlds were not reckless or foolish. They were, at some point, simply more loyal to the interior life than to the performance of it. And that is not a small thing. In a world that asked women to perform, almost continuously, the version of themselves that was socially acceptable, choosing the interior life over the performance was an act that required more courage than the romance novels generally acknowledge. The servants, too, the footmen and grooms and gardeners who found themselves in impossible positions through no fault of their own, who lost their livelihoods and their references and their carefully constructed professional lives because the social machinery had placed them in a situation it had not designed for. They were not villains or supporting characters in someone else's story. They were people with their own histories and their own losses, navigating a system that was not built with their interests in mind and never pretended otherwise. 2 centuries have passed. The drawing rooms are gone. The livery has been retired. The specific architecture of Regency social control has dissolved into history, and the world that made these situations so costly has been replaced by one that is, in most of the relevant ways, considerably less cruel. but the underlying human experience that all of it was built around, the feeling that arrives without permission, the gap between the person you're supposed to be and the person your interior life insists on being, the cost of wanting something in a world that has opinions about your wanting that has not gone anywhere. It is still here. It has simply changed its costume. So tonight, as you pull the blanket up and let the last of the Regency drawing rooms fade, perhaps spare a quiet thought for the women who felt things in worlds that had no room for the feeling and who found ways, imperfect, costly, sometimes beautiful, sometimes devastating, to carry those feelings anyway. They were not tragic figures. They were not romantic heroines. They were simply people, doing what people have always done, living inside the collision between the world as it is and the self as it insists on being, and making of that collision whatever they could. Sleep well. You've done nothing more scandalous tonight than listen. And in Regency England, that would have been quite enough.